Le sommet international de l'éducation du futur réunit une soixantaine de conférenciers du monde entier. Des pionniers et des innovateurs issus du monde de l'éducation, bien évidemment, mais également des êtres inspirants, issus des chemins de sagesse ou des chemins d'apprentissage et de créativité dans différents domaines. Les arts, les sciences, l'économie, le lien avec la nature, le sport, etc. Des expériences et des chemins de vie qui sont un formidable enrichissement pour le monde de l'éducation. Le professionnalisme des traductions, en simultané, et l'incroyable richesse de toutes ces conférences offrent un horizon de point de vue vaste et varié, très complet, qui en font au final une véritable formation professionnelle pour les enseignants, les éducateurs et tous les professionnels de l'éducation, mais également une formation à la parentalité consciente et une formation individuelle à la vie consciente. Face à toute cette richesse et aux divers retours, nous avons décidé d'offrir toutes ces conférences à tous, partout dans le monde, en français et en anglais, quelquefois en allemand et en espagnol. Découvrez la vision d'acteurs audacieux et influents du changement, vers un monde éthique, solidaire, généreux et profondément respectueux de tous, des cultures, des peuples, des règnes et de la planète. Un incroyable panel de conférences, couvrant toutes les dimensions de l'éducation, pour un futur ayant du sens, une humanité épanouie et une terre qui respire. Une chose est sûre, votre vie, et à travers vous, celle des enfants, ne sera plus la même après avoir écouté toutes ces conférences. Pour avancer, nous avons besoin de vous, nous avons besoin de votre générosité solidaire. L'organisation du sommet et l'édition des conférences ont nécessité des milliers d'heures de travail et nécessitent encore beaucoup de temps et d'investissement. Nous faisons appel aux dons libres et spontanés pour compléter le financement du sommet et, si possible, continuer à l'enrichir de nouvelles conférences. Votre soutien est vraiment précieux et vital pour aller jusqu'au bout de cette aventure extraordinaire. Merci.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I have the honor of introducing Jessica Joelle Alexander today. She's a best-selling author of a book called Danish Parenting. And she explains the Danish Way of Parenting, and she explains all the marvelous ways that parents deal with their children in Denmark and also in the education system, which makes people the most happy, the children the most happy children that they are. They are free to play. She puts the accent of free play, especially no over-programming, authentic way of sharing with the children, positive thinking, empathy, no ultimatums, and she's here today to share that this way is not just an education, it's a philosophy of life. And I'm really honored to be here with you, Jessica, to hear about all this. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm a cultural researcher, and I've been studying the Danish culture for 20 years. I'm actually American. I'm not Danish. I'm married to a Dane, and I'm raising my kids with the Danish way. And I do a lot of speaking and consulting around the world for parents and also for schools. And in fact, today what I want to talk about is the Danish Way of Education. And hopefully people can experience a new perspective and leave with something that they can implement today. So I'm going to start a little bit with just my story and my background, and then we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the Danish Way of Education. So 20 years ago, I was exposed to the Danish culture. I met my husband-to-be, and when I went to Denmark for the first time, I was very impressed by the children. So it wasn't the weather or the food or anything like that, the taxes, but the kids were extremely happy and serene, and I marveled at this kind of different relationship that I observed between parents and kids, and you never heard yelling or screaming or any of these things, and the kids just seemed so serene. And over time, I began to observe that there really was something different going on. And later, much later, I had my own children. And when they were born, I found myself going to my Danish friends and family for advice, because I always preferred their advice to books that I had read or family. And then one day I read that Denmark was voted as the happiest country in the world. And this was a big shock for me, because in America, we are obsessed with happiness. We have thousands of books devoted to happiness, and yet we score very low on the happiness scale. So what really surprised me then, when I looked into it, was I found that it wasn't just 1 year that Denmark was the happiest country in the world, but for over 40 years in a row, they're always in the top 3. This year, they're number 2. And I've thought, okay, this is, I believe it's about the way they raise kids, because happy kids grow up to be happy adults who raise happy children. And it's a cycle that repeats itself. And so this was like, I knew that I had to write about it, because it had affected me so much as a person and a parent. And now the book is in 32 countries. I think it really resonates with a lot of people, because it's very much, let's say, common sense based, I think. Nothing has changed. Like, Denmark it's not a commercialized country. So fads and new things don't come in to earn money. It's very much kind of based on what's good for the people. And so after I wrote The Danish Way of Parenting, I began really getting interested in education, because also the education model is very special and different. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first I want to mention something called our default settings. So as a cultural researcher, one thing I really noticed is, and we're here across 5 continents today, so every culture has a different way of doing things. And we all believe that our way is the right way. That's just normal, okay? And no place will you see this more dogmatically than in parenting. So this is actually called parental ethnotheories. So what that means is you believe what your way of parenting and education is the right way. It's very dependent on our culture. And the only way that we can really understand or make change is by examining what our culture has ingrained in us, so that we begin to question, why do I think this is the right way? Do I really believe this, or is this something that I have been trained to believe? And only then can we start to say, okay, maybe that's not necessarily the right way. So I talk about this a lot in parenting, but today I want to talk about our default settings in education. So I was preparing for my kids' education very, 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 very early. I was researching colleges, savings plans, and my husband said, maybe we should get pregnant before we plan the education. That's not a joke. So that just shows you like how, like in my culture, we're so, education is such a big deal. It's so expensive. It's so important. And, that people a lot of times start saving plans when their kids are born. And this just was the right way. So it was only through my husband's Danish eyes that he was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Another place that I noticed it was when my daughter was born. I every game she had or any toy she had, I felt needed to have an educational twist. So it had to teach letters or numbers or, and it was only when I started understanding this very play-based educational model in Denmark that I started questioning, why am I trying to make my 1-year-old learn letters? Why can it not just be play? And again, I think this is so culturally ingrained in so many cultures where we think we have to teach early academics because that's the best for our kids. And so I started me on this journey of, what is a good measurement? What is a measurement of a good education? And, in a lot of countries, the measurements are the grades, the test scores, all of these kind of standardized measurements. And this is very different in Denmark. But before we talk about that, I just want to say, just to give you an idea of how intense it is, and I know a lot of other cultures have this, like I've spoken to many Indians and Asians, and so recently they did a survey in America of 10,000 children from 33 school districts, and they asked what they felt their parents cared about the most, what they felt was the most important thing. And they could choose from being a caring person, getting good grades, being happy. The kids were 3 times more likely to say that they thought their parents cared about good grades, far above being a caring person and being happy. And they also believed that their friends' parents would feel the same. And this is from just a couple of years ago. So I think that just gives you some insight into how our kids are feeling. And I think most parents can if we really look at it, there's a scary truth to this. Another interesting study shows that in America, we use the words smart, talented, and gifted 30% more than other places. So this is also something we put on kids very early on. We have this kind of obsession with academics and being smart. But if a child is not good at taking tests, for example, how do they thrive in this kind of environment? There's a famous quote. They say it's from Albert Einstein. I don't know. It's a meme going around. Where everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And so we're in these places with incredible standardized testing as being the only measurement for success. My sister's a teacher. She tried to start teaching material off that was not going to be on the test. And another teacher came in and said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Well, I want to give the students more, some more rich background on this." And she said, "Don't bother, it's not on the test." Because teachers are measured by the test, the school is measured by the test, etc. So what do you think this was one of my first big shocks. So I'm gonna walk you through a lot of my eureka moments when I was in Denmark. What do you think is the biggest measurement of success in Denmark? A good educational measure of success. If anybody has any guesses, please shoot it out to me. Yeah, just
Happiness? Well-being?
Yeah. So the most important standardized test that they take in Denmark, right, every year, all the students, all the teachers, is called a trivselstest. And trivsel basically means well-being, thriving, yes, happiness. The test has absolutely nothing to do with academics. I have one here actually. I'm just going to read you like some of the questions that they have. Yes, when something is unfair, I feel like I can speak up. I'm good at working together with others. Hold on. They're in Danish, I'm translating, so bear with me. I feel like I'm seen and heard in my school. I really like the breaks at my school. Most of my classmates are friendly and helpful. The teacher tries to take the students' ideas and involve them in the teaching. So on the school's websites online, you will find the trivsels level, right? So you can see how like the level of well-being of a school, because this is considered like the most important thing for teachers and parents, is that the student feels well. And
excuse me, Jessica, can you spell that test so people can find it?
Yeah,
I will write it in the chat.
Yeah, it's called TRI.
Yeah.
VSEL.
SEL.
Trivsel. Yeah, Danish does not sound like it reads.
Thank you so much.
Sure. So the kind of motto for with a V, V like Victor. Trivsel. So the idea is that if you don't feel well, you cannot learn well. And this is a very different kind of approach to education, that the way you feel comes first. They don't believe that you can do academics if you're feeling bad. Another big difference that they stress in the school system, and this is something that has affected me even now as an adult, I think it's so profound. They make a big point of talking to parents about the difference between self-confidence and self-esteem. So in America, I always felt like this is just kind of the same word. You know, if you have one, you have the other. But in Denmark, they make a big point of explaining that they are different and that we really need to focus on building both. So the way they describe it often is with a tree. So if you can imagine a tree, and all of the leaves on the tree represent the things you can do. So your grades, your test scores, your accomplishments, how popular you are. So this is like the things you can do. And this is what people see, and that's your self-confidence. Self-esteem is like the roots of the tree. And this is sort of how you feel about yourself as a person, regardless of the things you can do. It's your meaningful relationships. It's how you feel about the people closest to you. And it's all the things that you cannot see. And so what often happens is we spend a lot of time building up the leaves, because we believe that if someone has all of these things dangling on their foliage, they must be so happy and successful. But we know what happens when the storm comes if you have little roots of self-esteem. So they make a big point of fostering that self-esteem, because that's really what takes you in life. And that's really where your kind of well-being sits. But we don't foster, we don't nurture it in a lot of other places. So this was very eye-opening for me, also in the sense that this is kind of tied to the way we also see our children. So some of the ways that we foster self-esteem, or the roots of self-esteem, is by seeing them for who they are, not for what they do. And so often our praise of kids when they're playing, of kids when they bring us something, is not to say, oh wow, that looks fun. It's to say, oh my gosh, you're so good at that. What an amazing artist you are. You know, it's not about the child's experience. It's about, let me assess you. And so often this is just a cultural default setting that we're not even aware of that we're doing, right? And so the child grows up, I had this myself, where you grow up and you think, well, I have to get good grades, I have to do all these things in order to be loved. So there's another wonderful expression in Danish, which is like a very highly valued characteristic in Denmark, and that is at hvile i sig selv. And what it means is to rest well within yourself. And this is kind of the goal of a good education, that you raise someone who rests well within themselves. And I think most of us would agree that that's kind of the dream of feeling happy and well-being. Now, some of the ways that they foster this in Danish education is, first of all, the meaning of education in Danish has two meanings. The meaning, like the word education, has two meanings. One is uddannelse, which is academics. So that's math, Danish, English, all that. And dannelse, which is how to be a good person, how to be a good human, how to take care of yourself, how to take care of others. And these are totally equal in how they are taught in the school system. When I first heard about this, I thought it totally blew my mind. Also because it's just so normal for them that, of course, you have both. And all teachers will say that, you know, they look at education as you have to walk on two legs. And one leg is the academics, and one leg is the dannelse, or the being a good person, being a healthy person, taking care of, being a good citizen. And, you know, you can't have one without the other. So they're just equally important. And now, the more I've studied it, the more I think it's crazy we don't have this in more schools. Yeah. So some of the sort of basis for dannelse, one is a big one, and this is also in the entire Danish society, parenting, teachers, is something called equal dignity. And that's basically that they see children as extremely competent from the time they're born, and they believe that adults, when you have more power as an adult, it gives you more responsibility. So you have more responsibility to not abuse that power, and to make sure that kids feel, you know, that they have, like I said, an equal sense of dignity. Some of the ways they do that is the teachers go by their first name. It's not like this high power distance. It's a much flatter structure. And this creates a much more harmonious environment. Denmark is also voted as the most empathic country in the world. It's the most trusting country in the world, and it has the lowest level of bullying in Europe. Again, if we're obsessed with measurements, it makes me wonder, why don't we study this more? A wonderful example, so they have equal dignity. They also have something where inclusion is a big part of the teaching. And by inclusion, I mean, if you remember on the Trives test, it said, I feel like my teacher takes my ideas and includes them in the learning. So that's part of the teacher's role, is that they have to make sure that kids are, their ideas, that it's not like, they describe it as a gas pump. So the old way of teaching is like pumping gas into their ear, or, you know, the old model where you just pumped knowledge. And now it's much more that it should be a kind of organic flow. And in fact, one of the cool places I noticed how this is so integrated into the culture is, when I would hear Danish people speaking English, I thought that they were making mistakes, because they would often say, I learned him math, or she learned me English. And I thought, oh, they just messed up the verb. But what I discovered is that in Danish, the verb at lære means to learn and to teach. So it means both. So it's kind of like the teacher and the learner together create the learning. It's this kind of Eastern philosophy. So they don't have a different word, but it's the same word. And I think that's really shows how much and how important this kind of togetherness in learning is. And then another sort of basic concept in the teaching is something called differentiere, which is essentially, I've heard it in other talks, seeing that the child is unique. They don't have grades until they're in middle school, because they feel that grades can be very divisive, and all kids learn at different rates. All kids learn at different rates. They generally catch up to each other at a certain age, and they don't see the point in forcing them to squeeze into some kind of math, like test or grade, because not only does it put anxiety on the child, who may learn to read at 9, some learn at 3, they're completely different. And so instead of putting that anxiety on the child by forcing them to read when they're not ready, they feel the parents' anxiety, they feel the teacher's anxiety. It also creates unnecessary competition with kids in the class when they should be working together, when they should be playing, when they should be focusing on growing rather than fitting into some little box. And one of the ways that I describe it is like the difference between the orchid and the dandelion. So an orchid is a really beautiful flower. It's very sensitive. It needs very special treatment. And when the orchid gets the treatment that it needs and the care that it needs, it grows into an extremely beautiful flower. If it doesn't get that care, it withers and dies. A dandelion is a flower that grows through concrete. It doesn't need any care, practically. It is so tough. We are organic. We are not robots. So this idea that we're kind of treated in this sort of everybody needs to fit this way is really crazy when you think about that example of the orchid and the dandelion, and how important it is, especially when our kids are young, to see them for who they are and to give them what they need. So another area where Danes are extremely gifted, I wrote this in the parenting book, it's something that's also changed my life a lot, is called reframing. And basically what reframing is it's being very good at focusing on positive details in an otherwise negative situation. So we are evolutionarily, as humans, we are a bit programmed to see negativity. We look for threats. We look for snakes. We look for what could happen, because this is just how we protected ourselves. But it is not functional for us anymore. It is not serving us. And in Denmark, they make a big point of helping children look for what they can do rather than what they can't. Not labeling children negatively. So you will almost never hear, oh, he's terrible at that. She's annoying. He's awful. He's so aggressive. Because the problem with labeling children is that oftentimes parents and teachers will say something hoping that it changes a child's behavior, right? Oh, he's so aggressive. He should stop that. She's so lazy. He's such a troublemaker. We say these things not because we want them to be that. But what happens is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The child keeps hearing it. They think, my mom thinks I'm like this. My teacher thinks I'm like this. So, I must be like this. And I think that if you look at any label you have for yourself now as an adult, you will often find that it came from your childhood. The important thing to understand is that you can change this at any time, and you can reframe, your beliefs. You can reframe how you see your children, and it will dramatically help them, and it will help you. And there's a lot of studies, brain studies, that literally show that reframing changes your brain chemistry. Now, what's really interesting about this from an educational standpoint is that Danes reframe on an even bigger level. And this is one of the major differences, I would say, between a lot of other cultures. And I think it's so profound, and I think it's starting to change, and there's more awareness. So in America, in many other places, we have built our kind of belief systems on survival of the fittest, right? We've been taught that humans are fundamentally selfish, we're individualistic, aggressive, that we're competitive by nature, and this has kind of been the view of mankind for centuries. But the reality is that, we didn't survive because we killed each other. We didn't survive because we had fangs and claws. We survived because we could collaborate. And so the question is, are we really selfish and wired for conflict, as many systems will have you believe, businesses will have you believe, educational systems will have you believe? And if you look at the literature, and if you look at some of the stories that get repeated over time, you would believe this. But social scientists and anthropologists are now beginning to completely question our story of human history and the stories we tell, and they are starting to see a very different pattern. So I just want to show you a little video now of, many of you have heard of the Lord of the Flies. So the book, The Lord of the Flies, it's the story of a lot of boys that get shipwrecked on an island, and they end up completely turning on each other. Millions of students have to read this book. Many people think this is the real view of human nature. But a Dutch historian, Rutger Bregman, very famous now, he has found the real story of the Lord of the Flies. And I'm going to show that to you now. Let me see if I can get this to work. Okay, I'm going to try. Share. Put it on here. Okay. And I'm going to play. Can you see that okay? Yeah, okay.
One of the most famous examples of this theory that people are fundamentally selfish in literature is the book Lord of the Flies by William Gurley. So many people have read it. Right? Millions of kids around the globe were basically forced to read it in school. I read it when I was 16 years old or 17, and I remember feeling quite depressed and cynical afterwards and thinking, well, no more Harry Potter for me. But it was while I was researching this book that I thought, has it ever happened that real kids shipwrecked on a real island? And how would they behave if something like that would happen? And so I went on this journey that started on an obscure blog where someone wrote that this actually happened near Tonga in the 60s. Tonga is an island group in the Pacific Ocean. And after a couple of months, I managed to track them down. So I found a guy named Peter Warner, who was an Australian captain, who was fishing in the vicinity of an island called Ata, a small island, basically a rock that sticks out of the ocean, in 1966, when suddenly he heard screaming. And he was looking through his binoculars and he saw these 6 kids, long hair, pretty wild appearance. What happens if you live on an island for a long time. Then these kids came and said, you know what, we're part of this school. And Tonga, we've been living here for 15 months. Can you bring us home? Now, Peter didn't believe it, so he called with the school and they said, yeah, actually, funerals have already been held. These are the real kids. So I spoke to Peter, the captain, and he put me in contact with his best friend, Mano Toto, who's one of the original Lord of the Flies kids. And so 50 years have passed since then, but they could still describe to me with vivid detail what happened and how these kids survived on this island for 15 months. Well, by working together, by cooperating. So they worked in teams of 2 to be on the lookout, to tend to the fire, to tend to the garden. And sometimes they did end up in fights. So then one of the boys would go to one side of the island, the other would go to the other side of the island, would cool off a little bit, come back and say sorry. That's how they kept going for months. So it wasn't easy, but they made it. And I think that can give us hope. And the thing is, if it would be a Hollywood story, a Hollywood movie, then people would say, well, this is very naive. That's not how kids would behave. It's very sentimental. But it's the real Lord of the Flies. The real Lord of the Flies is a story of friendship, of hope, of working together. It's pretty much the opposite of what we've always heard. Now, I'm not saying it's a scientific experiment. It's obviously just an anecdote. But we humans tend to become the stories that we tell ourselves. And for decades, we've been telling ourselves this pretty cynical story of kids turning on one another. And what are kids supposed to learn from that? It's not a very happy message, is it? So I think that whenever any teacher says to the kids, well, you need to read Lord of the Flies, then let's also tell them about the one time that we know of in all of world history where a real kid shipwrecked on a real island, because that's a very different story. I think that most people...
Oops, so I'm share screen now. So I just think that's a really nice example of many stories which have been sort of twisted and turned to fit this narrative. And this idea of reframing, that the more we fit our stories into this idea that we're, super selfish and individualistic, it's only perpetuating that. And so the Danish model is not based on survival of the fittest. It's survival of the friendliest. And this is a humongous part of their schooling system. And so what they have found actually is that one of the biggest factors that affects trivsel, which was the word that meant well-being that we saw earlier, which is what the tests were on, one of the biggest factors that affect well-being is another completely unpronounceable Danish word. It's called fællesskab. And I've written a lot about fællesskab. It's basically what it means is it is belonging, togetherness. It's a feeling of collaboration and unity that comes from being together when we have a shared purpose. And fællesskab is a huge part of Danish society. It's a part of their educational system, and it is seen as fundamental for well-being. So what do I mean? I mean that this idea that we have to collaborate and work together and give up a piece of the me for the we is something we should learn, and we should start very young, because we need each other as humans. And really, this is something I never ever thought about before, and how meaningful it is and how much it affects our well-being. But it's a really big deal. I mean, we know now, for example, that we have done a lot of brain studies. We understand the brain much more, and the same regions that register physical pain in the brain also register social pain. So it's called the social brain. We are wired to connect to each other. Having friends is not a luxury for children. Learning how to be together is so important. And from a study level, if you want some scientific facts to back it up, they've done a lot of studies in an analysis of over 300,000 participants in the Danish prosperity survey. They found that the level of fællesskab, or togetherness in schools, was highly correlated with not just happiness levels. It was correlated with better academics, more school drive, improved learning, better involvement, and competence levels. Harvard Center for Transformational Studies is now studying this phenomenon, and not surprisingly, they're finding exactly the same results. When kids feel better, they learn better, and their social lives and their sense of belonging and togetherness is huge in affecting their sense of well-being and how they learn and how good their academics are. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about fællesskab because it's very interesting, I think, that they have two different kinds. I'm not going to give you a Danish test after this, don't worry. You wouldn't recognize the words if you saw them, they're crazy. But no, there's two kinds of togetherness, okay? So one is called forpligtelsesfællesskab, which means obligated togetherness. So this is responsible togetherness. And this is really this idea we talked about before where, you kind of have to learn to give up a piece of the me for the we. Because regular fællesskab, which is more like hygge, maybe you guys have heard of hygge. We're going to talk about that later. That was like the famous word from 2016. Looks like this. Hygge. Anyway, so regular fællesskab is much easier because it's a natural thing. It's when you're with people you like to be with. It's when you're with family you want to be with. It's when you're with friends. It's a cozy time with others, which is easy. Forpligtelsesfællesskab is when you need to go to that family gathering that maybe you don't want to, or you have to collaborate with someone that you don't really want to, or you have to play with people that it's harder to play with. So forpligtelsesfællesskab is more like this sense that in order to be part of this community, I also have to sometimes give up a piece of myself. So, the basis for it is, we're not individuals on a desert island. We're not alone on a rock. We really need others, and we need to rely on others. And that means that we sometimes have to compromise, and we sometimes have to do things a little bit against our own wishes. And this takes practice. But it's, like I said, if you start doing it when you're younger, it becomes natural. And all the research also shows that the quality of our relationships, the more we're able to work together, has a direct effect on our well-being. So some of the ways that they teach forpligtelsesfællesskab in school is with something called duksa, which is basically chores. So like kids in school are responsible for cleaning the school, or, organizing things, doing things together. Again, it's not like the one person who has one chore, which it is in some classes, right? You have everybody has their individual chore. This is really about working together to accomplish something. They have gatherings. So they have something called fællesskabs gatherings. So this could be like 3 times a week, 5 times a week, once a week, where they come together with the sole purpose of improving the togetherness. And this could be doing a lot of different things, which we'll talk about later. But the point is that they feel it's really important to dedicate this time to improving the togetherness. It's that important because the togetherness is tied to the trivsel, the well-being, which is tied to the academics. It's not one before the other. It's more in that order. Play is a huge place that they foster this togetherness and belonging. As I said before, play in Denmark is considered the most important thing that a child can do. It is an educational theory. It has been since 1871. Children make wonderful discoveries going outside themselves of their comfort zones to play with someone else. It requires courage. It teaches empathy and resilience, and play is a wonderful place where they create this kind of togetherness. Because when kids are building a pirate ship together, they're not thinking about why this kid is different or why we're not the same. They're just building their pirate ship, and everybody gets a role and everybody has a purpose. And that's why play is a wonderful place to build this social network for kids. It isn't always easy to come into the fellesskap, and that's why it takes practice. And I always say to parents to remember that we're the role models. And, some of us didn't grow up with this. A lot of us didn't grow up with this. So it's also important to be aware of the message we're sending to our kids, right? I mean, I have had to rethink family gatherings completely. When I'm like, okay, yes. And I reframe and I use empathy and I try it because I think it's also really important that we send this message that, this is also part of our being in a community, and this is part of being in a family, is that we give up a piece of the me for the we sometimes. So just to give you an idea of how important this is and the message that this sends, in Denmark, they have a lot of commercials which are for helping people, think about the good of society. And one of the commercials they put out went viral. It's been remade now by universities and churches all over the world. And it's actually a great example of an exercise that teachers use in the classroom. I've actually used this exercise in classrooms in different schools across the globe. And I think it shows this idea of not putting people in boxes and trying to focus on the things that we have in common rather than things that we don't. So it's this reframing idea. So I'm going to play this for you because I think it's a really, really nice example. Oh, can I share? Why can't I share? There it is. Share. I need to go down and find it. Where is it? There it is. Okay.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual. And we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life. And we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think. TV2 Denmark.
So yeah, I just think that's a really nice, a nice way of showing, right, how they, you know, this thing of focusing on what we can do rather than what we can't, and what brings us together rather than what separates us. And these are just some pictures of Fedescape examples. So again, the idea is that you make space in the teaching, in the day, and in the education for other things than just academics. So that could be making a mural for the school. It could be gardening. It could be, you know, the forest school you saw before, doing things outside together. This is a fetish summoning. This is a togetherness gathering. You can see in the bottom corner where they come together. They often sing. Singing is a wonderful example of fellesskab and hygge, because when you sing, if you sing too loudly, you don't hear the others. If you sing too softly, you can't be heard. So it's only through harmony and really being together that you reach, you know, a good harmony in singing. So they are crazy singers. And I used to feel really dorky when I was singing in Denmark, but when I would allow myself to give up my ego and give up the me for the we, you feel it. You feel that sense of belongingness and everything. And so another reason why this is so important to give these opportunities to create belonging is because, you know, we're all good at different things. So some people are good at math, some people are good at English, some people are good at gardening, some people are funny, some people are good at playing Lego. And the more opportunities we give children, other than just grades and tests and memorizing things, it allows kids to see other aspects of each other and other things that they're good at, and to feel competent. So some of the needs that we have as human beings, we need to feel competent, we need meaning, and we need a sense of belonging. And so the more opportunities we give for children to develop those, the more we can find these similarities and come together rather than push each other away. And one of my favorite quotes is, when we give up the I and replace it with we, even illness becomes wellness. And I think this is it in a nutshell. And I think this is really the mind shift that we have to make, the importance of creating more togetherness, creating more collaboration, learning how to give up the I for the we, and practicing more hygge. And I will just, this is my favorite quote, the way I would describe hygge, which is the kind of cozy fellesskab where where we really make time to be together in a space where we leave out our negativity, we leave out our stress, we leave out complaining and bragging and controversial discussions, and we come together to be present in the moment with others, people we care about, and we respect this time. I always say that hygge is not, let me see if I can break it down here. Oh, push it down, hold on. It's not mindfulness. Hold on, if I can get it out of here. It's not mindfulness, it's we-fulness. So, we talk about mindfulness being this focus of being in the moment, being present, and it's very tied to well-being, and a lot of studies are showing this. I feel like the Danes have taken mindfulness and they have evolved it into this idea of being together with others in the moment, leaving out all of the other stuff for a period of time and connecting. And so it's much more like we-fulness. And it is hugely recharging for the soul. Children are the biggest benefactors of this. They love to be around their families when it's drama-free, when it's not negative. And in Danish schools, they actually have hygge rooms. So they have a room that's like for hygge, for kids to go in. But they don't all have that. They don't have to have it because hygge is such a part of their culture that it's seen as absolutely necessary that they make time for this. It could be playing games, it could be play, and I'm talking about all the way up to high school. It's just it's really, really important because this idea of being together and this idea of taking care of each other and enjoying the moment and enjoying others is profoundly important. So I actually have a lot more, but I will leave it open for some questions now. If anybody has any specific questions, they're welcome to write to me. But yes, I wanted to leave some time for some questions as well, if there are any.
I didn't see any questions yet, but beautiful appreciations for everything you're sharing. Personally, I'm blown away because I already knew about some things in Denmark, and but the way that you're talking about it, it makes it even, it deepens it for me. I wanted to say that in the introduction of you, but I created an educational model in California where I lived called I-We, and I published a book, and one day I received an email from a Danish teacher who said, I read your book, and actually I wanted you to know that in Denmark, everything you talk about in the book is part of our national education. And was like, wow. And so I asked him to share more, and he ended up writing a chapter for the next book when I translated it. So where he talks about the education, and actually I have some questions about that if nobody else asks. The chapter he wrote to me, because it was translated, I had to translate it, and it wasn't easy. And he spoke about other things. I can find like things you didn't talk about, words that I didn't recognize in what you spoke, that maybe you can speak to. I'm having a hard time seeing because it's a chapter, but maybe it's different kinds of school that even go for parents too.
Højskole.
Yeah,
Probably.
Yeah.
So actually, we go there every summer. I go with there's all different kinds, one is called Højskole, which only exists in Denmark that I know of. So this has several. You can go back at any time, also as a parent, but this is also something that you can go with your family. They have like family camp things. And then there's also something called efterskola, which is it's when Danes finish the first schooling, which is like 15, I would say, they can choose to take a year and go to something called efterskola, which is basically, it's a place where they go to mature. They can practice, they have everything, sports, music, art, I mean, you name it, there's an efterskola that has these different subjects. It's not academic, nothing academic. Writing, journaling, and the whole idea is that it helps them get better at fellesskap. So they're there to be with other students, to learn how to take care of themselves, you know, to be part of a group, to develop themselves in different ways, and kind of to mature. And the kids can decide whether they want to do it or not, but it's very, very, very popular, because it's you know, it's at that age when kids are starting to kind of, you know, they're breaking away anyway, and they maybe don't want to go straight into more academics. So they have this time to like, oh, I think it's such a good idea. It's also a time when parents have struggles with their teens, you know. So it's also a wonderful time where the teens can feel like they're maturing, but it's still in a safe environment, and it's a way to like develop other skills, other competencies, again, so that you don't base your whole life on whether you go to an Ivy League school or whether you get into the right college or you get an F or you don't, you know what I mean? Like these crazy standards that we put up, like kids put on themselves.
Yeah.
This is a way to say like, I want to develop myself in another way. But something I didn't mention, which I think is important, one of the ways that they work a lot on empathy and hygge in the school system is something called the classes hour. So I've written a lot about this as well. It's called Klassenstimer. And basically what it is an hour a week from age 6 to 16, where the class comes together just for the well-being of the class. So if there's any issues in the class, if there's any problems, so this could be like girl cliques or, you know, any kind of problems, you know, in the lunchroom, then this is the space where either the student can bring it up or they can ask the teacher to bring it up. Some teachers have a mailbox they can put, you know, issues in. And the teacher's only role is not to say who's right or wrong. It's just to make sure that they feel heard. Because usually we have this habit of, you know, thinking of your defense, or, you know, not listening to what the other person's saying. But this is the only purpose is to say, but do you understand why she felt that way? And this is happening from, like I said, from 6 to 16, an hour a week, and they can call it at any time. So maybe in a week they call a class hour randomly if there's some issues. Because again, the belief is that when the group is happy, the individual is happy, right? So they can't just let a problem go. And this is really different. I mean, even in my kids' school now, which I'm really happy with their school, but like you have a teacher meeting and I'm very interested in the social situation, you know, like I want to know, well, how's she doing socially? My daughter's in middle school. And the teacher's kind of like, well, we don't touch that. You know, that's why, I don't know. We don't touch, it's only, we're just going to talk to you about how she's doing in math. And I feel like this is such a common thing, whereas in Denmark, it's just the opposite. It's like, well, I feel she's really getting along more with others. She's really helping out the kids in math. Yeah, they have another really cool thing, which is, I'll tell this story about my husband. So when he was in school, he'd gotten this test back in English when he was in like high school or late middle school. And they don't give high grades in Denmark. I mean, you have to be really, 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 really good, because again, they don't like this kind of striving for perfection. You know, that's not the deal. That's not the objective. But he got this really, really good grade back. And when the teacher handed him the test, she didn't say, awesome, great job, let's put it on the wall. You know, she said, du er forpligt, which means you now have an obligation. You're so good at English, you now have an obligation to help others. Right? How cool. I mean, how I get goosebumps even just, you know, it's so when kids are very popular in the class, they have an obligation to help others. Because again, you know, you might be really popular in this group, but maybe you're not in this group. You might be really good at math, but terrible at soccer. So we all have to kind of help each other in different arenas. Nobody's good at everything. And when you learn this from very young, you know, it just, if you know any Danish people, there's just like a kind of humility and an ease, right? Generally. And I think it's because they don't have this like competitive thing inbred, you know, it's much more like, you know, easygoing. And I think it's because from early on, it's wonderful to be good at things. We all want to be competent at something, but it's also important that we take care of each other. You know, and you hear teachers saying that all the time. Remember, we have to take care of each other. Remember, we have to take care of each other. And wow, I didn't hear that in my school growing up. I didn't hear that in my school. But I wish I did, because I do think it's definitely the key to more happiness, more well-being, better relationships. Again, I always say resting well within yourself or having these values doesn't mean that you won't become super successful. You know, this is the fear some people have, but it's like whether you walk on the moon or whether you walk on a beach, you'll feel good inside. And this is kind of, I think, what we want, right? And that's this idea of like, it's not about survival of the fittest, it's survival of the friendliest.
Yeah, so true. I say that to the kids. I always say, you know, if one of the kids is not happy, then we stop and we look what's going on. We don't just ignore it and continue to play. It's not okay. It's really, we have this idea, we call it Ubuntu. You know, like in Africa, you know, the story of the anthropologist, who went to Africa and he asked a group of children to do a race, and who would win the race would have a cake, a beautiful cake. And the children all looked at each other and they took each other's hands and they ran all together. And at the end, he looked at one of the big ones and he said, well, why didn't you run faster? You could have eaten the cake. And he said, how can I eat the cake when all my brothers and sisters, they're hungry? And he said, you know, he didn't want it for him. And it's that idea of we are together. And I really, really love that. I actually have a question for you because one of the things I have struggled with in all the schools I went to teach is violence in America. So I lived in California for 30 years and then I moved back to France about 6 years ago. And even in France, moving back to France, I worked in a couple Montessori schools. In public school was even much worse, but even in the little alternative Montessori schools, there were kids who actually are not kind to each other, if not violent. There are violent children. And I wanted to ask you how the Dane or what you recommend. For example, if you have a child who is like 3 years old and who is not kind to others, who kicks and bites or hits, and you tell him repeatedly it's not okay, but he continues. How does Danish people or you, that really fascinates me, and I'd love to know.
Well, I mean, of course, it depends on the age, right? So, if obviously what you do with younger kids would be different than older kids. But if there was a continued, I would say they would try much harder to understand, they're very much about the child's, the meaning behind the behavior, what's going on with the child, what's going on with the parents. Parents are very much involved. The school system and the parents are a team. Parents are seen as part of the fellesskab. So in fact, they call the parent in Denmark the invisible classmate. Because whatever the parent is saying at home, whatever the parent is doing at home, the child will bring into the classroom.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant answer.
So they would involve the parents. So parents, it's almost your plicht as a parent. It's your responsibility to be part of the parent group. So the parents have a fellesskab, right? So the parents are required to also make group gatherings, to also plan things together, because they find that when the parents are there and get along, and when the parents are talking about the issues in the class is better. But they would always try to see what was going on with the child, they wouldn't label the child badly. They wouldn't label, as being mean, or, it's always about the adult having the responsibility to understand what's going on. And this is something called relational competence. I don't know if you ever heard of that. This is a big thing in Denmark, relational competence. So that the relationship with the child, the teacher's relationship with the child, is super important. And there's a whole training that goes into this, like how they meet the child, the three meaning, like the child needs meaning, competence, and belonging. It's a big thing, but it would be a team effort.
That's a great point that you say, because I think that's part of the problem too in the rest of the world, in the way they train teacher. They will get trained maybe 4 years college to become a teacher, and in those 4 years there's no education on empathy, on relationships, right? And so here we let loose a teacher with 30 kids or 20 kids in the classroom who's had no training.
Right.
No,
and I feel super. I think it's totally backwards.
Yeah.
Teachers need far more training, I think, in how to help with these, with again, building up humanity, dealing with these emotional issues. Because what happens is, of course, they don't have any training in it, and nobody's focusing on it. There's no Trives test. It's only being measured on academics. So it's like, let me just push all of this stuff aside. And it's much easier to say, oh, he's just a bad kid. And in Denmark, what's really interesting, especially the older they get, but I mean, they're working on it from very young, but the older they get, the more they say, there's no bad kids, only bad group dynamics.
That's great.
So they work on the dynamics of the group. And they did a big study, and they found there was what's her name? Dora Sunderborg Hansen, I can't remember her name. She did a big study because she wanted to understand, why is there bullying in some classes and not in others? Because she's like, a lot of people say it's the aggressive preying on the weak, or it's, this person that has a bad home life, and there's all these reasons. But she said, why is it happening in some classes and not others? And what she found, she did a big study, hundreds of questions for kids outside of Copenhagen, and about everything: home life, friends, academics, school, everything. And what she found was the biggest predictor of when a class had bullying is when there was low tolerance in the class. So if a kid said, I don't feel like I can speak up, there's only one person who decides in the class, these kinds of things. If those questions were answered in a positive, then there was bullying. if they said, I feel like I can speak up, I feel like my voice is heard, I feel like everybody there was no bullying. And so what they discovered was it was often tied to the dynamics of the group and the hierarchy of popularity. So this is a whole course I do where they have a way to measure the hierarchy of the group. And through this understanding of, like, if there's a steep hierarchy of popularity, like if there's someone really popular and someone who nobody wants to play with, if there's a high gradient of popularity, then there's a lot of bullying. The minute they learn how to flatten the hierarchy, so they do this with Fellowscape, but they strategically plan the Fellowscape activities based on the information about the hierarchy. So they put the more popular with the middle and the this and that, and they see how they can fix the group dynamics. And the minute the group dynamics get fixed, they find the bad behavior stops.
That sounds amazing. I would love to learn about that. Who did this?
Daughter, I can't remember her name. Daughter Minnesota. Anyway, if you look on, I just wrote a paper for Berkeley all about this.
Yes.
If you go to my Instagram or you go to it's not on a website yet, or my LinkedIn.
Do you want to put it in the chat so people can have it too?
I can put a link to the paper. So I did just like a 10-page paper for Berkeley all about this.
Fantastic.
Hold on, let me just find it.
Somebody wrote, how do the schools work on self-confidence and self-esteem in Denmark? At what age do they begin working on it? Can you share with us some examples? Thank you.
Yes, so it's from day one. It's seen as such an important. Like I said, we talked about it before, right? So, for example, with little kids, it's kind of what I said before. It's like, first of all, it's us being aware as parents, and I'm speaking for non-Danes because Danes kind of do this naturally. As parents, it's this thing about hearing yourself. So, for example, if kids are playing, if your child's playing on the playground, oftentimes we have the tendency to either say, oh, great job, or be careful, and this kind of makes it about us. Whereas building self-esteem is more like, again, that looks like fun. If they draw a painting or they scribble a drawing, instead of saying, wow, you're an amazing artist, instead saying, why did you draw that? What were you thinking when you drew that? You see, that's showing interest in the child's experience. It's not making an assessment. And what happens is the more we assess, the more they seek that assessment, because that's more based on love, right? So it's fine to build self-confidence. They are good at things, right? But you got to be careful with the labeling. And for example, we talked about this smart, talented, and gifted, and how obsessed we are. She's so smart. She's so talented. It's like, oh my God, it's a 3-year-old. And what's interesting about that is that what they find, and I wrote about this in the Danish Way of Parenting, they've done a lot of studies where they found that kids who grow up with these labels, right, of being smart, right, or gifted, they found that when they were getting older, if they had to do a test or they had to do a project that was getting hard for them, they would either give up or some of them would cheat, because they didn't want to lose that smart status. And they thought, God, if I have to try really hard, that must mean I'm not smart, and I don't. So I'm going to make an excuse, right? Whereas they found that kids that were, always, they weren't given those labels, but they were told, to work hard, or that it's always with you can always improve. You can always get better. You can, there's no such thing as a math person or not a math person. It's like you either study it and you get better, right? And you learn from your mistakes. So they say in Denmark, they say fail is first attempt in learning. And this is kind of that process praise, right? So it's about praising for the process rather than giving them a label. So that's one thing. And then I think with the self-esteem is very much built through these hygge. So spending time with your child and letting them know you like them for who they are. You play games. You let them lead in the play. You spend time where, it's not about achieving something. And this is that goes back to that idea. It's not mindfulness, it's we-fulness. Right? And so that builds up this sense of like, wow, they like me for me, I like me for me. I don't need to accomplish all of these things in order to be liked. I think that's kind of like the roots of self-esteem.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Wow, we have so much to learn. It's incredible when you think of a country, and like I think I read somewhere it's measured for 40 years, the happiest country in the world. I mean, we've known this for 40 years, the rest of Europe, the rest of the world. What are we waiting for to take a model? It's crazy,
I don't know,
isn't it?
I don't know. And you know what? I don't live in Denmark. I live in Italy right now.
Oh, okay.
And so, I mean, I'm trying to kind of like get this out and implement. It's not, I always say, it's not that we have to recreate Denmark. I'm not trying to recreate Denmark, but clearly some of these ideas, like the hygge, like the free play, like fællesskab, the we-fulness, I mean, clearly this is working. So I think after the pandemic, my hope is that maybe it's the moment that we can start looking at the research and the measurements, which are
we have Peter who's coming after you, who is a great researcher on the neuroscience of all this as well, the power of play. And so that's going to be really a nice complement to everything that you have offered us today. And
I wrote a lot about Peter Gray in the Danish Way of Parenting.
Well, maybe you'd like to introduce him I was going to, but if I would be honored if you would, if you'd like to.
Well, I don't have his biography. I'm a big fan of his work, and we I have a whole chapter on play, and I knew that the Danish model was play based. And I knew that it's all, it's an educational theory, and I needed the American perspective to back it up. And Peter Gray's work is brilliant for this. So it was a really nice compliment for the Danish way.
Fantastic. Somebody said, thank you for what you shared. Really interesting. I wish we could have this kind of education in France. I don't understand why we stay on old models of education. Yeah. Yeah, I also, that idea of, what you say when they're 15, that's what was that teacher wrote in the chapter in my book, but that year off is like so important. I always say, even before you go to university, take a year to go travel, to go do something else, to make a pause and let all this knowledge, experience sink in before you jump into it again. And I think that's important too. And I love that in Denmark, it's part of it. Now you say not everybody has to do it, right? It's possible, but it's an option.
It's an option. I mean, some people will also do a year abroad, for example, they'll do an American high school, or they can go straight into, they can do an extra year of school and then go into school. But I would say, 9 out of 10 families that I know, their kids have done after school.
Yeah, Fantastic. There's somebody who asked if you could leave an email, so if they had further questions,
sure,
they could
sure.
contact you.
And as I said, I'm about to come out with a course all on this bullying thing, because I think this we have to take.
That's fantastic. You know, I was with a group of young people last night, a round table, and that subject came up. I had already spoken with one of the young people who spoke about it, and the other kids said, but in the conference I had with him alone, he said to what degree it was huge, the bullying for him. Like he was one of those kids that was easy to bully, and he suffered from it greatly. And what he said is that he went to teachers to tell them, you know, this person is hurting me, this person hit me, and that very, very little was done to help. And another kid that was on the panel said for him as well, when he was younger, it happened. And the same, he went to the teacher, they didn't help. So he learned how to not care himself. So in a way, it toughened him, he said, but he still felt so sad. And it makes me want to cry just thinking about it, how little they're supported.
I mean, we know that bullying has such long-term effects. So
I'm so glad you're doing this course, and it's a course for teachers, for schools.
Yeah, it's a course for teachers, and there's stuff for parents in it as well. And like I said, that paper has some of it, but I try to give the whole examples of how you can measure the hierarchy of the group, how to do the activities to help flatten hierarchy, and let's hope. I mean, this is great. Let's share more of these ideas so we can make some change.
Yes, that's really awesome. Well, I thank you so much. If there's anything else you can say, you still have a few minutes before we start with Peter. Closing words.
Oh, I would again say, if anybody wants more information, they're welcome to reach out to me. I think that's everything. It was a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to hearing Peter.
Fantastic, Jessica.